Imagine that you hate your neighbor so much that you simply build a house for the sole purpose of blocking your neighbor's view. The whole story is so crazy you won't be able to believe it. Aside from a woman who put an entire house in front of her neighbor's nose, you can expect even more crazy and insane actions in this video that people have used to get back at their neighbors. So let's get right to the point. By the way, let us know in the comments if you've ever had problems with any of your neighbors. And we'll start with this strange controversy from France. Two neighbors clashed so often that one of the two men finally tired of facing his opponent in person. So he flew his drone with his camera into the garden next door, just to annoy his neighbor. And he succeeded wonderfully, as you can see here. The neighbor tried to get the drone out of the middle with a broom, which turned into a real fight. But because the drone pilot was maneuvering skillfully, the neighbor eventually gave up in anger. Of course, this drone video of a man throwing fireworks at his neighbor because he kept listening to music too loudly is much more impressive. You may have already seen the video, as it went viral on social media as an example of a particularly intense dispute between neighbors. However, it turned out that the whole incident was not malicious. We continue with a violent dispute between neighbors in Orlando in the U.S. state of Florida. At some point, a pair of homeowners realized that the property boundaries on official documents were different than they had previously assumed. Parts of the neighboring house were owned by the couple. And because you are allowed to build a fence on your property boundaries, the couple did just that. They built a fence right inside the pool and even inside their neighbor's house. By the way, there was a similar case in Germany. A professor bought a road next to his house, blocked it with a fence, and then demanded a toll from his neighbors if they wanted to use the road. After a court prohibited this approach, the situation between the professor and his neighbors completely escalated and even went as far as fighting. The story continues with Brian Jewell from the small town of Sequim in Washington State, USA. The American was in a dispute with his neighbors that had been going on for years, but when they dared to paint their house purple, Brian went crazy. In his eyes, such a colorful house didn't fit in with the neighborhood, so the American got on his tractor with his lawnmower and spent hours mowing huge swear words in a nearby meadow, along with a large arrow pointing at the neighbor's house. By the way, the offending letters are so huge that they are even visible on Google Maps. Now let's move on to the house we told you about at the beginning. The so-called Mont Lake Pie House, which you can see here, looks like a slice of pie from above. While it's about 4.5 meters wide on one side, on the other it's only about 2 meters wide. It's also remarkably thin and stands directly in front of a larger residential building. Because of its strange layout, this house in the US immediately makes you wonder why it was built this way. A woman who lived with her husband in a large house received only a small portion of the joint property when they divorced in 1925, namely the front garden. Because the couple was very estranged and the woman wanted revenge, she had the Mont Lake Pie House built on that small front garden after the divorce. This way, she completely shut out her ex-husband, who remained in the larger house, but without the beautiful views. Incidentally, a similar revenge house can also be found in Beirut, Lebanon. When two brothers quarreled in the 1950s, one of them built a house that was less than a meter wide but 11 meters long, solely to block his brother's view of the sea. The man in our next story would surely be happy if his neighbors would simply mow their grass with abusive words as before. 2 years ago, the 45-year-old man from New Jersey, USA, had to walk the so-called walk of shame to get into his own house. His neighbors were responsible for this. The man could only walk around under police protection, while hundreds of neighbors shouted at him, pushed him, threw beer at him, and threw objects at him. What at first glance almost looks like a scene from Game of Thrones and seems like a nasty act of intimidation by neighbors can, however, be explained. The man had previously repeatedly insulted his dark-skinned neighbors in the worst possible way and had also used violent racist language. At some point, they had had enough, and so, along with many others in the neighborhood, they took revenge, forcing the 45-year-old to walk the walk of shame. We move on to the next case. When American Gabriel Braun discovered that half of his neighbor's garage, with whom he had been at odds for years, was on his property, he destroyed the part that was his. So he secretly loosened the part of the garage that was on his property and eventually tore it down with a backhoe. Gabriel's goal was to get his obnoxious neighbors to finally move out of their house. Let's continue with a very strange dispute between a tenant and his neighbors, who are also his landlords. 2 years ago, tenant Kevin wanted to build a patio in his garden, which he eventually did himself. However, he had not previously sought permission from his landlords. They were shocked. So the landlord and landlady removed the slabs from the patio. But the story doesn't end there, because Kevin then simply reinstalled the slabs. When the owners saw this, they removed them again. And so it went on and on. Kevin built on the patio every day and his landlords trashed it every night. In the next case, the two neighbors Thomas and Gerd had a real neighborly war for a long time. What started as petty squabbles gradually escalated, and almost daily acts of revenge were carried out by one on the other. Among other things, trees were sawed down during the neighborly dispute, and even one of the men was not afraid to throw poisonous plants down his neighbor's well, suddenly causing him so much vomiting and stomach pain that he had to visit a doctor. But that wasn't all. To annoy his neighbor, Gerd also bought a rooster, which he encouraged to crow. At least that's what Thomas accused Gerd of. He, in turn, accused his neighbor of, among other things, damaging property and theft. The men repeatedly accused each other, and their heated disputes have already been referred to various courts. That was our video for today. Subscribe if you found it entertaining, and we will see you next time here at Wise Fool.